A lonely billionaire was a virgin at 45, until a poor girl knocked on his door one stormy night. He had everything, money, mansions, and fame, but not one person who truly cared if he lived or died. She had nothing. No home, no family, just a broken suitcase and a dog shivering in the rain. When he let her in, he thought it was just an act of pity. But her kindness began melting a heart that had been frozen for decades. Then, the cameras showed up. The headlines exploded. The world called her a liar and him a monster. But there's something she's hiding, a truth that could ruin them both or save them forever. What really happened behind those mansion doors? And when love meets loneliness, will it heal what's broken or destroy what's left? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The distant rumble of thunder echoed across the Pacific, its deep bass resonating through the steel and glass of Elliot Dane's clifftop mansion. Rain pelted against floor-to-ceiling windows, distorting the angry ocean view beyond. Elliot sat in his study, surrounded by stacks of charity proposals that had occupied his evening, each one meticulously annotated in his precise handwriting. His fingers drummed against the polished mahogany desk, a habit he'd developed over years of solitary nights. The clock on the wall showed 9:37 in the evening, its soft ticking barely audible over the storm. Like everything else in his carefully ordered world, the study reflected rigid control. Books arranged by height, pens aligned at perfect angles, papers sorted into exact piles. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the room in stark white. In that brief flash, Elliot caught his reflection in the window, a man of 42, whose graying temples and deep-set eyes spoke of burdens carried too long alone. The power flickered once, twice, then plunged the mansion into darkness. "Perfect," he muttered, reaching for the emergency flashlight he kept in his desk drawer. Its beam cut through the darkness as he navigated the familiar path through his home. The marble floors felt cold beneath his feet, each step echoing in the emptiness. These halls had never known the warmth of family laughter or the chaos of shared lives. Instead, they held only the weight of his memories, his father's rage, his mother's prayers, the crushing loneliness that followed her death. Another crack of thunder shook the windows. Elliot paused, tilting his head. Beneath the storm's fury, he heard something else, a sound so foreign to these halls that at first he couldn't place it. A knocking, desperate and urgent, coming from his front door. He hesitated. In 15 years of living on this isolated stretch of coastline, no one had ever appeared unannounced, especially not in weather like this. The security system should have alerted him to any vehicle approaching the property. Yet the knocking continued, more insistent now. Elliot moved cautiously towards the door, flashlight beam bouncing off the walls. Through the decorative glass panels, he could make out a shadowy figure, small and hunched against the rain. His hand hovered over the security panel, years of careful isolation warring with something else, a whisper of his mother's voice, reminding him of kindness. The knocking came again, weaker this time. With a deep breath, Elliot disabled the security system and opened the door. Wind and rain immediately assaulted him, but it was the sight before him that made him step back. A young woman stood on his doorstep, completely drenched. Her dark hair plastered against her face, water streaming from her clothes to form puddles at her feet. In one arm, she clutched a small dog that shivered violently against her chest. Her other hand gripped the handle of a battered suitcase, its sides torn and muddied. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible above the storm. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but my car—" She glanced back toward the road, where Elliot could now see the dim outline of a vehicle tilted awkwardly on the shoulder of his private drive. The dog whimpered, drawing Elliot's attention back to the woman. She was shaking, whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. Droplets fell from her eyelashes as she looked up at him, and something in her desperate gaze struck a chord deep within him. A memory of another storm, another night when he'd needed help and found only locked doors. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "Kindness, Elliot. Promise me you'll remember kindness." The security cameras showed no other vehicles, no threat hiding in the shadows. Just a woman, a dog, and a storm that seemed determined to wash them both away. Every instinct honed by years of protecting himself from the world told him to close the door, to retreat to his ordered solitude. But that voice, his mother's voice, wouldn't let him. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. "You'll catch your death out there." Relief flooded her face as she hurried past him, the dog still trembling in her arms. Water pooled beneath her on the imported marble floor, a mess that would have normally sent him into a quiet fury. Tonight, somehow, it didn't matter. "Thank you," she breathed, her teeth chattering. "I didn't know what I was going to do. There's no cell service out here, and when I saw your lights—" She stopped, noticing the darkness around them. "Oh, the power's out here too." "It just went down," Elliot replied, closing the door against the storm. The security system re-engaged with a soft beep, momentarily illuminating their faces in green light. "Wait here." He moved purposefully through the darkness, retrieving towels from the guest bathroom and a battery-powered lantern from the emergency supplies he kept meticulously stocked. When he returned, she stood exactly where he'd left her, as if afraid to impose herself further on his space. "Here," he said, holding out the towels. "There's a powder room just down that hall if you'd like to dry off." He paused, studying the small dog that hadn't stopped shaking. "And your companion?" "Max," she supplied, managing a small smile as she accepted the towels. "He's usually braver than this, but the storm—" "There's a utility room with a dryer," Elliot found himself offering. "If you'd like to dry your clothes, I can find you something to wear in the meantime." The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise her. In 15 years, no one had worn his clothes, used his dryer, or accepted his hospitality. The careful walls he'd built around his life didn't allow for such intimacies. Yet here he was, leading a stranger and her dog through his darkened home, the beam of his flashlight illuminating the way. The woman followed silently, her wet shoes squeaking against the floor. Max had finally stopped trembling, his dark eyes watching Elliot with what seemed like cautious interest. "I'm Rosa," she said suddenly, as if realizing she hadn't introduced herself. "Rosa Martinez. I'm sorry for disrupting your evening like this." Elliot nodded, unsure how to respond to the warmth in her voice. They reached the utility room, and he busied himself finding the emergency generator's switch. Light flooded the small space, making them both blink. "The generator only powers essential systems," he explained, gesturing to the dryer. "But this should work. I'll find you something to wear." He left her there, climbing the stairs to his bedroom, where he kept clothes he'd never worn, gifts from business associates who thought they knew him, items ordered online and never returned. In a drawer, he found sweatpants with tags still attached, and a university sweatshirt he'd been given at a tech conference. When he returned, Rosa had already changed into one of the towels, wrapped around her like a makeshift dress. Max sat at her feet, considerably fluffier after his own toweling off. Her wet clothes tumbled in the dryer, the machine's hum a strange addition to his usually silent home. "Thank you," she said again, accepting the dry clothes. "I know this must seem crazy, a stranger showing up at your door like this." "Your car," Elliot said, redirecting the conversation to practical matters. "What happened?" Rosa's face fell slightly. I hit something. A branch, maybe. The storm was so bad I could barely see. The car spun out and—" She shook her head. "I'm just grateful we saw your lights. Well, before they went out." Thunder crashed overhead, making Max bark sharply. The sound echoed through the marble halls, so foreign in this space that Elliot almost jumped. Rosa knelt to comfort the dog, murmuring soft words in Spanish. Standing there in his utility room, watching this woman console her pet, Elliot felt the carefully maintained order of his world shifting. The quiet halls that had been his refuge now seemed oppressively empty. The storm that had been background noise became a living thing, driving this unexpected intrusion into his solitude. "Once you're changed," he heard himself say. "I'll make some tea. The kitchen runs on the generator as well." Rosa looked up, surprise and gratitude mingling in her expression. "That would be wonderful. I haven't been warm since the car." She stopped, seeming to sense his discomfort with too much personal disclosure. Elliot retreated to the kitchen, his movements automatic as he filled the electric kettle. The familiar ritual of preparing tea gave his hands something to do, while his mind grappled with the evening's turn of events. From his methodical review of charity proposals to hosting a stranger and her dog, it was more disruption than he'd allowed in his life for years. The storm continued its assault outside, but inside something else was brewing. As Elliot reached for the teacups, his mother's photograph caught his eye. It sat on a high shelf, her gentle smile forever frozen in time. She would have known what to do in this situation. She would have made it seem natural, this act of kindness to strangers. "Kindness, Elliot," he could almost hear her say. "It costs nothing but means everything." The kettle clicked off, steam rising in the dim light of the generator-powered under-cabinet lighting. As Elliot prepared the tea, he realized with startling clarity that for the first time in 15 years, his evening routine had been completely derailed, and somehow the world hadn't ended. Through the beam of his flashlight, Elliot studied the young woman before him more carefully. Rosa Mayfield. She looked no more than 26 years old, her dark hair plastered to her face from the rain, shoulders trembling beneath the oversized towel he'd provided. Max, her small dog, had settled at her feet, occasionally shaking himself and sending water droplets across the utility room floor. "I'm so sorry," Rosa began, her voice catching. "I missed the last bus, and I had nowhere else to go. Derek, my ex-fiancé, he—" She swallowed hard, tears welling in her eyes. "He took everything. My wallet, my phone, even my grandmother's ring." Frederick Mason appeared in the doorway, his normally stoic expression tight with concern. He cleared his throat meaningfully, and Elliot recognized the signal. His butler wanted a private word. "Excuse me a moment," Elliot said, following Frederick into the hallway. In the dim emergency lighting, Frederick's face was all sharp angles and shadows. "Sir, I must advise against this. We know nothing about this woman. These days, scammers are increasingly sophisticated. A young woman, a sad story, a stormy night. It's textbook." Elliot started to nod. Frederick's caution had protected him from countless opportunists over the years. But something made him pause. Through the partially open door, he could see Rosa kneeling to comfort Max, who was whimpering at another crack of thunder. The genuine tenderness in her gesture stirred a long-buried memory. His mother's face, pale against hospital pillows, her last words barely a whisper. "Never close the door on mercy, Elliot. It's the key to healing both the giver and receiver." "She stays," Elliot said quietly, surprising both Frederick and himself. "At least for tonight." Frederick's eyebrows rose slightly, but he knew better than to argue once Elliot had made a decision. "Very well, sir. I'll prepare the blue guest room." When they returned to the utility room, Rosa was standing exactly where they'd left her, though her trembling had increased. The wet clothes in the dryer tumbled steadily, providing a rhythmic backdrop to the storm's chaos outside. "Please come with me," Elliot said, leading her through the marble hallways. The emergency lighting cast long shadows across the expensive artwork and antique furniture. The fire's still lit in the living room. The grand living room, with its 20-foot ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows, was normally an imposing space. But tonight, with only the fireplace providing light, it felt almost cozy. Rosa sank gratefully onto the leather sofa nearest the flames, while Max curled up at her feet. "I can't thank you enough," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know this must seem crazy, just showing up like this. I promise I'm not usually so—" She gestured vaguely at herself, managing a weak smile. "Are you hungry?" Elliot asked, deliberately steering away from emotional territory. Rosa hesitated, then nodded. "I haven't eaten since breakfast," she admitted. "But please don't go to any trouble. I can help. I'm actually a pretty good cook. It's the least I can do to repay your kindness." "That won't be necessary," Elliot said quickly, uncomfortable with the idea of a stranger in his kitchen. He pressed the intercom button on the wall. "Frederick, could you bring some of the soup from dinner?" "Right away, sir." While they waited, Rosa stared into the fire, occasionally wiping away tears she seemed to be trying to hide. Elliot found himself studying her profile, noting the gentle curve of her chin, the way the firelight caught the gold flecks in her brown eyes. There was something both vulnerable and resilient about her that made him think of delicate things that refused to break. Frederick returned with a tray bearing a bowl of steaming soup, fresh bread, and hot tea. Rosa's eyes widened at the sight. "This looks amazing," she said, accepting the tray with trembling hands. "Thank you so much, Mr. She trailed off, realizing she didn't know his name. "Dane," he supplied. "Elliot Dane." Recognition flickered across her face. His name had been in enough business news headlines, but she didn't comment. Instead, she focused on feeding Max small pieces of bread before taking any herself. "The guest room will be ready in 20 minutes," Frederick announced, his tone professional but still carrying a hint of disapproval. "You're letting me stay?" Rosa looked up, surprise evident in her expression. "I thought maybe just until the storm passed. I don't want to impose. I could clean or cook to earn my keep, or—" "One night," Elliot said firmly, cutting off her offer of service. "We can figure out next steps in the morning." Fresh tears welled in Rosa's eyes, but these seemed different from before. "Thank you," she whispered. "I was so scared out there with nowhere to go. You have no idea what this means." The raw gratitude in her voice made Elliot uncomfortable. He wasn't used to such naked emotion, to being looked at with such genuine appreciation. It stirred something in him he'd thought long dormant, a warmth he hadn't felt since his mother's death. Thunder crashed outside, but inside, the fire crackled steadily. Rosa ate her soup slowly, savoring each spoonful as if it were a feast. Max had fallen asleep, his small body rising and falling with peaceful breaths. Frederick moved silently through the room, lighting a few battery-operated lanterns to supplement the firelight. As Elliot watched Rosa warm herself by his fire, something shifted in his carefully ordered world. The mansion that had felt like a fortress of solitude for so many years suddenly seemed different, less like a shelter from the world and more like a shelter for it. When Frederick returned to announce the guest room was ready, Rosa gathered Max gently in her arms, careful not to wake him. "I don't know how to thank you properly," she said, looking directly at Elliot. "Most people wouldn't have even opened their door tonight." Elliot merely nodded, unsure how to respond to such sincere gratitude. As Frederick led her upstairs, Elliot remained by the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. His mother's words echoed in his mind again. Never close the door on mercy. For the first time in years, he felt something stir in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire before him. It was uncomfortable, unfamiliar, and yet somehow right, like a key turning in a long, rusted lock. The carefully constructed walls of his solitude had developed a crack, and through it, something dangerous but essential was seeping in. Compassion. Morning light crept through the mansion's tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Elliot descended the grand staircase at precisely 7 o'clock, just as he did every morning. But today was different. Unfamiliar sounds and scents drifted from his usually silent kitchen. The aroma of fresh coffee and something else, eggs, filled the air. Elliot paused, his hand resting on the polished banister. The last time someone had cooked breakfast in his home, his mother had been alive. That was 15 years ago. He found Rosa in the kitchen, wearing clothes that Frederick must have sourced from the staff's spare uniforms, simple black slacks and a white button-down shirt that was slightly too big for her frame. She moved between the stove and counter with quiet efficiency, her damp hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. "Good morning," she said, turning when she heard his footsteps. "I hope you don't mind. I wanted to do something to thank you, and cooking is—" She gestured to the stove, where eggs sizzled gently in a pan. "Well, it's what I know." Max, her small dog, wagged his tail from his spot near her feet. Elliot noticed she'd fashioned a makeshift water bowl from a shallow dish. "You didn't need to do this," Elliot said, his voice stiffer than he intended. "I know, I wanted to." Rosa's smile was gentle but determined. "Please sit. The coffee's ready." Before Elliot could protest, Frederick appeared in the doorway. The butler's usually impassive face showed surprise at the domestic scene before him. Behind him, Maria, the housekeeper, peered in with undisguised curiosity. "Sir?" Frederick's tone carried a question. "It's fine, Frederick," Elliot said, surprising himself as much as his butler. He sat at the kitchen island, a spot he'd never used before, always taking his meals in the formal dining room. Rosa placed a steaming mug of coffee before him, then returned to the stove. The kitchen filled with more staff members, drawn by the unusual activity. They hovered at the edges, watching as Rosa plated perfectly cooked eggs, crisp toast, and what appeared to be home-fried potatoes. "I found some herbs in the garden window," she explained, setting the plate before him. "They really brighten up simple dishes." The food looked nothing like his usual breakfast of precisely measured portions prepared by his chef. This was homey, casual, the kind of breakfast his mother used to make. "Please," Rosa said to the lingering staff. "There's plenty. I made extra." The kitchen staff exchanged glances, then looked to Elliot. He nodded slightly, and gradually they filtered in. Rosa served them each a plate, her movements graceful and natural, as if feeding people was as essential as breathing. Elliot took a bite. The eggs were perfectly seasoned, the potatoes crispy outside and tender within. He couldn't remember the last time food had tasted like this, like comfort, like care. After breakfast, Rosa insisted on cleaning up, despite Frederick's protests. "Please," she said, already filling the sink with soapy water. "It helps me feel useful." She worked methodically, scrubbing each pot and pan until it gleamed, while Max watched attentively from his spot by the door. Throughout the morning, Elliot found himself repeatedly drawn back to the kitchen, ostensibly to check emails on his phone. Each time, he found Rosa engaged in some new task, organizing cabinets, wiping down surfaces, or playing with Max during short breaks. The dog had clearly bonded with her, following her movements with devoted eyes. At lunch, Rosa made simple sandwiches, insisting on serving Elliot despite his protests. As they ate, she began to talk, her voice soft but steady. "I used to work at the Women's Hope Community Shelter," she said, absently breaking off pieces of her sandwich for Max. "It was the most meaningful work I've ever done. Helping women rebuild their lives, watching them find their strength again." She paused, her eyes distant. "But then I met Derek." Elliot stilled. The Women's Hope Community Shelter. He knew it well, though no one knew he was its primary benefactor. "He seemed so charming at first," Rosa continued. "He said all the right things, made all the right promises. By the time I realized who he really was, he had access to my bank accounts, my credit cards." She swallowed hard. "He took everything. Even my car is in his name. I had to leave my job at the shelter because he kept showing up, causing scenes. The women there, they'd been through enough. They didn't need to see that." Elliot's mind raced back 3 years to a stack of thank you letters from shelter residents. One, in particular, stood out. A carefully handwritten note expressing gratitude to the anonymous donor who had given her a second chance. He remembered the name at the bottom: Rosa Mayfield. While Rosa continued clearing the lunch dishes, Elliot slipped away to his study. In his wall safe, behind the charity documentation, he kept every thank you letter he'd ever received. He found hers quickly, the paper slightly yellowed now, but the words still clear. "Dear friend, your generosity has given hope to so many of us at the shelter. Sometimes knowing that a stranger believes in second chances is enough to help us believe in ourselves. Thank you for being that light in the darkness. Sincerely, Rosa Mayfield." That evening, after Rosa had gone to the guest room with Max, Elliot sat in his study, holding her driver's license. Frederick had found it in her wet coat pocket and brought it to him. A sensible precaution with a stranger in the house. But as Elliot stared at the small plastic card, he wasn't thinking about security. He was thinking about second chances, about mysterious donors and thank you letters, about the strange turns life could take. The woman who had written that heartfelt letter 3 years ago was now sleeping under his roof, having fled another situation that had stripped her of everything except her dignity and her capacity for kindness. The irony wasn't lost on him. Her words about believing in second chances echoed in his mind, taking on new meaning in light of their unexpected connection. Morning light filtered through the mansion's tall windows, casting long shadows across Elliot's office. He sat at his desk, staring at the same email for 20 minutes, his mind elsewhere. The guilt gnawed at him. Every time he thought about Rosa's story, about the shelter, about her gracious thank you letter, his stomach twisted into knots. He should tell her. The words sat heavy on his tongue, but fear held them back. Would she think he'd manipulated the situation? That he'd let her stay because he knew who she was? The truth was, he hadn't known until after he'd made that choice. But would she believe that? A gentle humming drew him from his thoughts. Following the sound, he found Rosa in the library, dusting shelves with careful attention. Max dozed nearby, his tail thumping lazily against the carpet whenever she passed close to him. "This room is amazing," Rosa said, noticing him in the doorway. "So many beautiful old books." She ran her fingers along the spines reverently, though they could use some loving care. Elliot watched as she worked her way methodically through the shelves, treating each book with gentle respect. She'd tied her hair back with a ribbon she'd found somewhere, and borrowed clothes hung loose on her frame, but there was a quiet dignity in her movements that struck him. "Oh!" Her exclamation drew his attention. She'd pulled out a dusty cardboard box, wedged between 2 volumes of encyclopedias. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to pry." She started to push it back, but several old photographs had already spilled onto the floor. Elliot's heart clenched. He recognized those photos, his mother's collection, hastily packed away after her death. He hadn't looked at them in years. Rosa was already carefully gathering them up, but she paused at one particular image. "Is this—" She held it up gently. In the photograph, a young woman with kind eyes held a small boy on her lap. They were both laughing at something outside the frame. "My mother," Elliot said quietly, surprising himself. He hadn't spoken about her to anyone in years. Rosa's eyes softened. "She looks so warm," she said, "like someone who gave wonderful hugs." She hesitated, then asked softly, "Do you want to tell me about her?" The familiar wall of resistance rose in Elliot's chest. "I should get back to work," he said, turning away. But he caught the understanding in Rosa's eyes. Not judgment, just gentle acceptance of his boundaries. Throughout the day, his thoughts kept returning to that moment in the library. He found himself passing by more frequently than necessary, watching as Rosa transformed the space. She'd found old cleaning supplies and was carefully wiping down each shelf, humming quietly to herself as she worked. Late in the afternoon, he noticed she'd moved on to sorting through a stack of books on one of the reading tables. His mother's Bible lay open, its pages well worn with use. As he approached, Rosa looked up with an apologetic smile. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "It seemed special. I thought it deserved its own place on the shelf." Elliot picked up the Bible, and a small piece of paper fluttered to the floor. Rosa reached for it, but he was closer. His heart stopped when he read the words written in her neat handwriting. "You have more warmth than you know." He stared at the note, emotions warring in his chest. When he looked up, Rosa had busied herself with the books again, giving him privacy with his reaction. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke as evening approached. The lights flickered once, twice, then plunged the mansion into darkness. Rosa's surprised laugh echoed through the library. "Don't move," Elliot said, trying to remember where he'd last seen the emergency supplies. He fumbled his way to a cabinet, nearly knocking over a vase in the process. "Left a bit," Rosa called out helpfully. "I saw some candles in that drawer earlier." Finally locating them, Elliot struggled with the matches. After the third failed attempt to light one, Rosa's gentle laugh floated through the darkness again. "Here," she said, moving closer. "Let me help before you burn yourself." Their hands brushed as she took the matches, and Elliot felt that same strange flutter in his chest he'd experienced when he first let her in from the rain. In moments, she had several candles lit, their warm glow creating a cozy circle in the vast library. "I suppose this means dinner might be a challenge," she said, amusement dancing in her eyes. "We could order—" Elliot started, then remembered the power was out. "I'm sure there's something in the kitchen we could have a candlelit picnic," Rosa suggested, her eyes twinkling. "I saw some bread and cheese earlier. Sometimes the simple things are best." Before he could protest, she was already heading towards the kitchen, Max trotting faithfully behind her. Elliot found himself following, drawn by the warmth of her presence. They ended up sitting on the library floor, a makeshift feast spread out between them. Bread, cheese, fruit, and some leftover cookies Rosa had baked that morning. The candles cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating an almost magical atmosphere. When Rosa nearly dropped her glass, reaching for an apple, she laughed again, a full, genuine sound that seemed to fill the entire room. To his utter surprise, Elliot found himself laughing too. It came out rusty and uncertain, more of a chuckle really, but it was real. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed like that. Rosa's eyes widened slightly at the sound, but she didn't comment on it. Instead, she launched into a story about Max's antics in the garden that morning, her hands moving animatedly as she spoke. The candlelight caught the silver ribbon in her hair, making it shimmer as she moved. Elliot found himself relaxing despite his usual reserve. There was something about the unusual situation. The storm, the darkness, the casual picnic on the floor, that made everything feel less formal, less structured, less scary. Max had settled between them, his head resting on Rosa's knee while his tail occasionally thumped against Elliot's leg. The dog's obvious contentment seemed to echo the unexpected peace of the moment. The guilt about the shelter was still there, lurking at the edges of Elliot's mind, but for now it was overshadowed by something else. Something warm and unfamiliar, like the candlelight that filled the room with its soft, flickering glow. The morning sun streamed through the library windows, catching dust motes in its golden rays. Rosa sat in the window seat, her morning coffee growing cold beside her as she stared at her phone in disbelief. Her hands trembled so badly she nearly dropped it. "No, no, no," she whispered, scrolling through the email again. Max whined at her feet, picking up on her distress. Elliot, passing by with his usual stack of morning reports, paused in the doorway. Something in her expression made him step closer. "Rosa, what's wrong?" She looked up, tears welling in her eyes. "It's Derek. He's suing me for defamation." Her voice cracked. "He says I lied about the abuse, that I made everything up to ruin his reputation." Elliot set his papers down carefully, his jaw tightening. "Tell me everything." Rosa's words tumbled out between shaky breaths. "My public defender just quit. Said the case was too high profile now. Derek's claiming I stole money from him, that I'm unstable and vindictive." She pressed her hands to her face. "He's demanding $200,000 in damages. I don't have anything left. He made sure of that when he cleaned out our joint accounts." "Let me help," Elliot said immediately. "My legal team is the best in the state." "I couldn't possibly. You can, and you will." His voice was firm but gentle. "This is what they're paid for." Within the hour, Elliot's head lawyer arrived at the mansion. Patricia Chen was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who listened intently as Rosa detailed Derek's manipulation and abuse. She took careful notes about the missing money, the isolation tactics, the escalating control. "Classic abuser playbook," Patricia said, her pen scratching across her legal pad. "He's trying to silence you with legal intimidation. We'll file a countersuit immediately." The paperwork was prepared and filed before lunch. Rosa felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since seeing Derek's lawsuit. But that hope was short-lived. By mid-afternoon, Elliot's security team reported multiple news vans gathering outside the mansion gates. His phone began buzzing incessantly with calls from reporters. The first headline appeared on a local news website. "Tech billionaire Elliot Dane houses mysterious young woman." More followed quickly. "Lonely billionaire takes in poor girl half his age. Gold digger or damsel in distress. The mystery woman in Dane mansion. Sources claim Dane's new house guest has troubled past." Rosa watched in horror as her face appeared on news sites, usually photos clearly taken with long-range lenses while she walked in the garden with Max. The stories twisted everything. Her presence in the mansion, Elliot's kindness, even Max became the sympathy prop dog. "I have to leave," Rosa said, pacing the study where Elliot was attempting to manage the crisis. "They're destroying your reputation. I never meant for any of this to happen." Elliot looked up from his phone, his expression resolute. "You're not going anywhere. I won't let them drive you away with lies." "But look what they're saying about you." She gestured at the TV, where a gossip show host was speculating about their relationship. "They're making you sound like some kind of predator." "Let them talk," he said, though she could see the tension in his shoulders. My PR team will handle it." But as the day wore on, the situation only intensified. Paparazzi gathered in growing numbers, their cameras flashing like lightning whenever anyone approached the gates. Reporters called every contact number they could find for the mansion. Some even tried scaling the security fence, leading Elliot to double the guard rotation. That evening, they sat in the darkened living room, watching the latest news coverage. The anchor's voice dripped with insinuation as she reported, "Sources close to the situation suggest Ms. Mayfield has a history of targeting wealthy men. Her ex-fiancé, Derek Langford, has filed suit claiming she fabricated abuse allegations after he discovered financial irregularities." Rosa felt sick. They were using Derek's lawsuit to paint her as a con artist. She watched Elliot's face as the reporter detailed his worth, his company's stock prices, his history of charitable giving, now portrayed as evidence of his vulnerability to manipulation. The cameras outside flashed again, their light cutting through the gaps in the curtains like accusatory fingers. Rosa pulled her knees to her chest, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Maybe I shouldn't have knocked," she whispered into the darkness. "Maybe I should have just stayed in the rain that night." Elliot turned to her, his face half-shadowed. The man who had built an empire from nothing, who faced down corporate raiders and hostile takeovers without flinching, looked genuinely troubled for the first time since she'd met him. Max pressed closer to Rosa's side, offering silent comfort as another barrage of camera flashes lit up the windows. Outside, they could hear reporters calling questions through the gates, their voices carrying across the manicured lawns like circling wolves. Rosa wiped her eyes, feeling the weight of guilt crushing her chest. The quiet sanctuary of Elliot's home had been shattered, and it was all because she'd dared to ask for help that stormy night. She watched as Elliot's phone lit up with another incoming call, watched him silence it with a grimace, and felt her heart break a little more. The peaceful world they'd briefly shared, cooking breakfast, cleaning the library, laughing over candlelit picnics, seemed to be slipping away, replaced by harsh camera lights and harsher headlines. The mansion that had become a haven now felt like a fishbowl, with the whole world pressing their faces against the glass. More tears fell as Rosa hugged Max closer, his warm presence the only solid thing in a world that seemed to be crumbling around her. Through the window, another camera flashed, freezing the moment in stark black and white. A moment that would likely appear in tomorrow's papers, twisted into something unrecognizable by those who dealt in scandal and sensation. Dawn broke over the mansion, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges that seemed to mock the chaos below. A sea of reporters had gathered overnight, their satellite vans forming a blockade around the property. Camera flashes punctuated the morning mist like artificial lightning. Rosa stood at her bedroom window, peering through a crack in the heavy curtains. Her hands trembled as she counted at least 20 news crews camping outside the gates. Max whined softly at her feet, sensing her distress. "I know, boy," she whispered, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "This is all such a mess." Downstairs, raised voices echoed through the marble halls. The staff had gathered in the kitchen, their usual professional calm replaced by worried debate. "We can't keep operating like this," Frederick insisted, his normally proper demeanor cracking. "They're harassing the cleaning staff when they arrive. Martha couldn't even get through the gates this morning." "But we can't just throw the poor girl out," Mrs. Chen, the cook, argued back. "Have you seen what they're writing about her? It's horrible." Rosa crept halfway down the grand staircase, staying hidden behind the carved banister as she listened. The guilt weighing on her chest grew heavier with each worried word from the staff. Elliot's voice cut through the chaos, calm but firm. "Enough. I've made a decision." The kitchen fell silent. Rosa held her breath. wondering if this was the moment he'd finally ask her to leave. "We're going to Carmel Valley," he announced, "to my mother's old estate." "The farmhouse?" Frederick's tone carried surprise. "But sir, you haven't been there in—" "Years, I know." Elliot's voice softened slightly. "It's private, secured, and far from the media circus. Have the caretaker prepare it for our arrival." Rosa's heart skipped. Our arrival. He meant to take her with him? "Miss Mayfield." Elliot called up the stairs, making her jump. "Please pack whatever you need. We leave in 30 minutes. The next half hour passed in a blur. Rosa threw her few belongings into her torn suitcase, while Mrs. Chen packed them food for the journey. Frederick arranged for a discreet exit through the service entrance, where Elliot's least conspicuous car, a simple black SUV, waited. As they slipped away from the mansion, Rosa watched in the side mirror as the reporters continued filming the main gates, oblivious to their escape. Max settled in the back seat, already dozing as the city began to fade behind them. The first hour passed in awkward silence. Rosa kept her hands folded in her lap, hyper-aware of every movement, every breath. Elliot focused on driving, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. They were strangers, she realized. Strangers who had shared meals and laughter, who had seen each other's vulnerability, yet still knew so little about one another. The weight of unspoken words filled the car like invisible smoke. Around noon, Rosa's stomach growled audibly. She blushed, but it seemed to break some of the tension. "We should stop," she suggested softly. "There's a small diner just ahead." Elliot hesitated, probably used to fine dining establishments, but nodded. The diner was exactly what Rosa had hoped for, a family-owned place with checkered tablecloths and the smell of home cooking. The elderly waitress didn't give them a second glance as she led them to a booth by the window. When their food arrived, simple hamburgers and fries, Rosa automatically folded her hands and bowed her head. She was halfway through grace when she realized Elliot was staring at her. "Sorry," she said, opening her eyes. "Force of habit. My grandmother always said every meal deserves thanks." Something flickered across Elliot's face. "My mother," he started, then stopped. After a moment, he slowly folded his own hands. Would you say it again?" Rosa's heart warmed as she watched him bow his head, following her lead as she prayed over their meal. His hands were clasped awkwardly, like he was remembering a long-forgotten gesture. The rest of the journey felt lighter somehow. They made 2 more stops, and each time, Elliot joined her in prayer without prompting. She caught him mouthing the words silently, like a child relearning a favorite song. Late afternoon sun painted the hills gold as they turned onto a narrow road winding through Carmel Valley. Ancient oaks lined the way, their branches creating tunnels of dappled light. Finally, they crested a hill, and Rosa gasped. There, nestled among wildflower-dotted meadows, stood a beautiful old farmhouse. Its white clapboard walls were nearly hidden beneath cascading sheets of ivy, and its wraparound porch sagged slightly with age. But even in its neglected state, it radiated a warmth that the marble mansion had never possessed. "It's beautiful," Rosa breathed as they pulled up the gravel drive. They spent the next hour exploring the house, Rosa exclaiming over every discovery: the hand-carved banister, the old-fashioned kitchen with its copper pots still hanging from the ceiling, the library with built-in bookshelves reaching to the ceiling. As sunset approached, Rosa began opening shutters, one by one. Dust motes danced in the golden light that poured through each window. The house seemed to wake up around them, shaking off years of darkness. Elliot stood in the doorway of the living room, watching as she worked. The tension had melted from his shoulders, replaced by something softer, more vulnerable. In the dying light, Rosa could almost imagine him as a child here, before wealth and loss had built walls around his heart. She opened the last shutter, and warm light flooded the room, bringing the faded wallpaper to life. When she turned, she found Elliot still watching her, his expression unguarded for once. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For letting the light in." Rosa smiled, understanding he meant more than just the shutters. Max trotted between them, tail wagging as he explored his new surroundings. The old farmhouse creaked gently in the evening breeze, like a contented sigh. Here, far from the cameras and accusations, surrounded by his mother's memories and Rosa's quiet grace, Elliot's face held something she'd never seen before: peace. Life settled into a gentle rhythm at the farmhouse as spring blossomed around them. Rosa woke each morning to birdsong drifting through the open windows, a sound so different from the constant hum of reporters and cameras they'd left behind in Los Angeles. The old house seemed to breathe easier with each passing day. Rosa tackled one room at a time, wiping away years of dust and neglect. She found joy in the smallest victories, polishing wooden banisters until they gleamed, washing windows until sunlight streamed through clear glass, arranging fresh wild flowers in long, empty vases. In the kitchen, she discovered drawers full of handwritten recipe cards in elegant script, Elliot's mother's handwriting. The first time she made her chicken pot pie using one of those recipes, Elliot stood in the doorway for a long moment, his expression soft with memory. "It smells exactly the same," he whispered, more to himself than to her. The porch became their favorite spot. Rosa spent mornings there with Max, drinking coffee and watching the fog roll away from the hills. She noticed how the worn boards creaked in certain spots and began dreaming of bringing the space back to life. One sunny afternoon, she drove into town and returned with trays of colorful flowers, pansies, petunias, and sweet-smelling alyssum. Elliot watched from his study window as she knelt in the dirt, planting them along the porch steps. "They'll cascade down like a waterfall when they grow," she explained when he finally ventured out to investigate. "Your mother probably had flowers here too. See the old pottery shards." It was during one of their now routine evening drives around the property that they heard it, a weak whimper from the roadside ditch. Rosa was out of the car before Elliot could stop, and there in the gathering dusk was a small, muddy puppy, scared and alone. "We can't just leave it," Rosa said, cradling the trembling creature. Her eyes met Elliot's, and something in his careful facade cracked. "The shelter's closed until Monday," he said slowly. "She needs food and warmth now." Rosa pressed gently. Max, watching from the back seat, wagged his tail in apparent agreement. Elliot sighed, but Rosa caught the slight upturn of his lips. "There's an all-night veterinarian in town." They named her Hope, Rosa's suggestion, which made Elliot roll his eyes but didn't stop him from carrying the puppy to bed that first night, tucked safely in his jacket. Meals became something special, shared on the porch, when weather permitted. Rosa insisted on using the old dining table she'd found in the barn, cleaning and refinishing it herself. She taught Elliot how to grill, something his wealthy upbringing had never included, and laughed at his first burned attempts. "You can run a billion-dollar company but can't flip a burger?" she teased, demonstrating the technique again. "Technology is more predictable than meat." He grumbled, but his eyes crinkled with amusement. Their evenings fell into a comfortable pattern. Elliot worked in his study, managing his empire remotely, while Rosa curled up in an old armchair by the window, with a book from his mother's collection. The quiet companionship felt natural, punctuated by the sounds of Max and Hope playing on the rug between them. One night, as thunder rolled across the valley, Elliot broke their usual silence. "He used to lock me in the cellar," he said quietly, not looking up from his laptop. My father, when I cried or made too much noise, sometimes for hours. Rosa set her book down but didn't speak, sensing he needed to continue. Mother would sneak down when she could, bringing cookies or stories, but she was afraid of him too. His voice grew distant. The last time I was 12, she tried to stop him and he... Elliot's hands tightened on his desk. 2 days later, she was gone. Brain aneurysm, they said. But I knew, we both knew, it was him. Rosa moved to his desk, placing her hand gently beside his. Not touching, but close enough to feel his trembling. I promised myself I'd never be weak again. He continued. Built walls, built companies, built this whole life where no one could hurt me. But sometimes... He looked around the study, at his mother's books, her photographs. Sometimes I wonder if I just locked myself in a different kind of cellar. You survived, Rosa said softly, her heart aching for the scared boy still living inside this powerful man. You survived so you could learn how to heal others. All those charities you fund, all those lives you've helped change, including mine. That's not weakness, Elliot. That's the strongest kind of healing there is. He didn't respond, but she saw the tear that slipped down his cheek. Later that night, as Elliot headed to his room, he paused in the hallway. Rosa's voice drifted from the library, soft but clear in the quiet house. She was praying, kneeling beside the armchair where she read each evening. Lord, please help him see the light you put inside him. She whispered. Help him understand that surviving doesn't mean he has to stay behind walls forever. Show him how to trust again, how to love again. And thank you for letting me be here to witness his healing. Elliot stood motionless, watching through the crack in the door as moonlight bathed her in its gentle glow. Something tight in his chest began to loosen, like ice melting in spring sunshine. Her simple faith, her unwavering belief in goodness despite her own painful past, touched something in him he'd thought long dead. He didn't enter the library, didn't interrupt her private moment with God. But as he continued to his room, the empty mansion felt a little less empty, and his heart felt a little less cold. Max and Hope followed at his heels, their paws making soft patterns on the old wooden floors, while Rosa's prayers continued to float through the hallway like a lullaby. In his room, Elliot found himself looking at an old photograph of his mother, her smile warm and kind, just like Rosa's. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the usual stab of pain. Instead, he felt something different, something that felt surprisingly like hope. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the study windows as Rosa organized decades of paperwork. Dust motes danced in the golden light while she sorted through old files, her methodical nature making quick work of the chaos. She hummed softly, finding satisfaction in bringing order to the cluttered office that Elliot had long neglected. Bills here, contracts there, she murmured to herself, creating neat piles on the antique desk. The drawer she pulled open next stuck slightly, requiring a firm tug. Inside, buried beneath yellowed papers, lay a stack of cream-colored envelopes held together with a faded blue ribbon. Rosa's fingers trembled as she lifted them out. The paper was expensive, thick and textured, exactly like the letters she'd received at the shelter years ago, letters that had given her strength when she'd lost everything else. With careful movements, she untied the ribbon. The first envelope bore a familiar cursive E in the corner. Her heart quickened as she opened it, recognizing the words she'd memorized during countless sleepless nights. Dear friend, remember that your worth isn't measured by others' cruelty. You carry within you a light that no darkness can diminish. Tears blurred her vision as she opened another, then another. Each one contained the same compassionate wisdom that had sustained her through her darkest hours. The handwriting matched perfectly, the same elegant slope, the same thoughtful phrases. "I never forgot these," she whispered to the empty room. "I used to read them every night, wondering who E could be." The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her look up. Elliot stood in the doorway, his expression changing from casual interest to recognition as he saw what she held. "I was just organizing," Rosa said softly, holding up the letters. "But I think I know who wrote these now." Elliot remained frozen, his face a mask of uncertainty. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. "It was you, wasn't it?" she asked gently. "You were the one who wrote to us at the shelter, the mysterious donor who never wanted recognition." He moved into the room slowly, like a man approaching something fragile. "I didn't want you to know," he admitted, his voice rough. "When you arrived here that night, and I realized who you were, I was afraid you'd think I'd manipulated everything." Rosa shook her head, tears flowing freely now. "These letters saved my life, Elliot. When Derek had taken everything, when I felt worthless and alone, your words gave me hope. They reminded me I was more than my circumstances." She stood, still clutching the letters. "Why didn't you tell me?" Elliot's shoulders slumped as he leaned against the desk. "I've spent my whole life hiding behind walls of money and influence. It was easier to help from a distance, to write those letters anonymously. I never expected—" He gestured helplessly at the space between them. "I never expected to meet someone who'd received them." "But why write them at all?" Rosa asked, moving closer. "Why take the time to personally encourage women you'd never meet?" His eyes grew distant, focused on some private memory. "My mother, she used to write letters to other abuse victims. Even when Father forbade it, she'd sneak them out through her church friends. After she died, I found her last letter unfinished on her desk." He swallowed hard. She'd written, "Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is remind others they're not alone in the dark." Rosa's heart ached at the pain in his voice. "So you continued her mission?" "I tried," he said quietly. "I could give money easily enough, but those letters, they were my way of honoring her memory, of trying to be the man she always believed I could be." "You succeeded," Rosa whispered, touching his arm gently. "Every woman at that shelter felt less alone because of you. We used to gather in the kitchen late at night, reading your letters aloud, drawing strength from knowing someone out there cared enough to write them." Elliot's eyes met hers, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I've spent so long hiding who I am, sometimes I forget how to be honest about the simplest things." The sun had set while they talked, leaving the study bathed in twilight shadows. Rosa gathered the letters carefully, placing them back in their drawer. "Come outside with me," she asked. "It's a beautiful night for stargazing." He nodded, following her through the house and onto the back porch. The evening air carried the scent of jasmine from the garden she'd planted, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. They sat on the old wooden swing, letting the quiet of the countryside wrap around them. Max and Hope dozed nearby, their peaceful breathing a gentle counterpoint to the chirping crickets. "Tell me about your mother," Rosa said softly. "What was she like?" For the next hour, stories flowed between them. Elliot shared memories of his mother's laugh, her secret cookie recipes, the way she'd sing hymns while doing housework. Rosa told him about her own childhood, about learning to cook from her grandmother, about the dreams she still held despite everything she'd lost. A cool wind swept across the porch, making Rosa shiver slightly. Without thinking, she reached for Elliot's hand resting on the swing between them. She felt him tense for a moment, years of defensive habits warring with the moment's intimacy. But then, slowly, his fingers curled around hers. The simple touch held volumes of trust, of walls finally beginning to crumble. They sat in comfortable silence, hands joined, watching the stars emerge one by one above the valley. In that moment, surrounded by the peace of a summer night, Rosa understood that sometimes the greatest acts of healing come not from grand gestures, but from small moments of connection. A letter written in kindness, a hand held in trust, a heart finally learning to open after 20 years of careful guarding. She squeezed his hand gently and felt him squeeze back. No words were needed. The stars continued their ancient dance overhead, while below, two souls found comfort in the simple act of being present with each other, no longer alone in the dark. The gentle morning sunlight streamed through newly opened windows at the farmhouse, casting warm patterns across freshly polished floors. Rosa hummed softly as she pushed each window higher, letting the sweet country air sweep through rooms that had been closed off for far too long. Behind her, Elliot watched with quiet amazement at how naturally she brought life into every corner she touched. "These windows haven't been opened in 20 years," he said, running his hand along a spotless windowsill. "I'd forgotten how bright it could be in here." Rosa smiled, wiping dust from her hands. Sometimes all a house needs is a little fresh air to remember what it's meant to be. She paused, looking at him meaningfully. "The same goes for people, you know." In the kitchen, their morning routine had become a dance of gentle teasing and shared tasks. Rosa showed patience as she taught Elliot basic cooking skills, laughing at his determined but clumsy attempts to help. "The secret is to keep your fingers tucked under while you chop," she demonstrated, skillfully dicing an onion. When Elliot tried to copy her technique, he nearly nicked his thumb. "I think I'll stick to signing checks," he muttered, eyes watering from the onion's sting. Rosa giggled, handing him a tissue. "The mighty tech billionaire defeated by a simple vegetable? What would your board of directors say?" "They'd probably short our stock," he replied dryly, but his eyes crinkled with amusement. As weeks passed, their days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Each morning, Rosa would wake early to tend to her growing garden, while Elliot handled necessary business calls from his study. They'd meet for breakfast, sharing quiet conversations over coffee and fresh-baked bread. One Sunday morning, Rosa stood in the doorway of Elliot's study, dressed for church. "Come with me today," she said softly. It wasn't the first time she'd asked, but something in her gentle persistence made him pause. "I haven't been since—" He trailed off, thinking of his mother. "I know," Rosa said. "Maybe that's why you should." The small country church welcomed them warmly, though several curious glances were cast their way. As they settled into a worn wooden pew, an elderly woman leaned forward with a kind smile. "So lovely to see you both," she whispered. "We don't often get new couples in our congregation." Elliot felt heat rise in his cheeks, but before he could correct her, Rosa simply smiled and thanked her. Throughout the service, he found himself distracted by the way Rosa's shoulder pressed against his, and how natural it felt to share a hymnal between them. After the service, Rosa suggested hosting a dinner for some of the local families they'd met. "Nothing fancy," she assured him, seeing his hesitation. "Just simple food and good company." Elliot agreed, though he insisted on using assumed names when organizing the donations. "It's better if they don't know who I am," he explained. "Money changes how people see you." The dinner came together beautifully, with Rosa transforming the formal dining room into a warm, welcoming space. Children's laughter echoed through halls that had known only silence for decades. Parents shared stories of hard times and small victories, while Rosa served homemade comfort food that reminded Elliot of his mother's cooking. Near the end of the evening, a small girl with braided hair tugged at Elliot's sleeve. "Mr. Dane," she said quietly, "my mommy told me to thank you for helping us when Daddy left. She said an angel must have sent you." Elliot froze, recognizing the child's mother as a recipient of one of his anonymous donations. Rosa, watching from across the room, saw the mixture of emotion cross his face: pride, embarrassment, and a deep, aching loneliness. After the guests had gone and the dishes were done, Rosa suggested a walk in the moonlit garden. The night air was cool and sweet, with the scent of blooming jasmine she'd planted weeks before. "You've helped so many people," she said as they strolled between the flower beds. "But you never let them thank you properly. Why is that?" Elliot was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I suppose I never wanted their gratitude. It felt too much like trying to buy something I didn't deserve." "What's that?" "Connection. Belonging." He stopped walking, looking up at the stars. "Love." Rosa turned to face him, her expression gentle but firm. "You don't need to buy the world's love, Elliot. Just let it love you back." The moonlight silvered her hair, making her look almost ethereal. Elliot felt something shift inside him, like a key turning in a long, rusted lock. Slowly, trembling with both fear and wonder, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was soft, hesitant, a question more than a demand. Rosa responded with equal gentleness, her hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling his heart racing beneath her palm. When they parted, Elliot's eyes were bright, with unshed tears. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered. "I've spent so long keeping everyone at arm's length." "Then let's learn together," Rosa replied, taking his hand. "One day at a time." They stood there in the moonlit garden, surrounded by the flowers Rosa had planted and the peace they'd built together. The night air carried the lingering scent of dinner and the echo of children's laughter, reminding them that sometimes the greatest acts of love aren't grand gestures or expensive gifts, but simply opening windows and letting light into dark places. The warm evening breeze rustled through the garden, carrying the promise of more shared meals, more laughter, more moments of quiet understanding. In the distance, a church bell chimed softly, marking another hour in a life that was slowly, surely, learning to bloom again. The autumn morning started peacefully enough. Rosa was hanging fresh sheets on the line, while Elliot worked in his study, the windows open to let in the crisp breeze. Neither of them expected their world to shatter with the sound of tires on gravel. A sleek black car roared up the driveway, kicking up dust. Behind it, 3 news vans followed like hungry wolves. Rosa froze, the white sheet still in her hands, as Derek Langford stepped out of the car. "There she is!" Derek's voice carried across the lawn, dripping with fake concern. "Rosa, darling, I've been so worried about you." Elliot heard the commotion and emerged from the house, his face hardening when he saw Derek. Camera crews were already setting up at the gate, their lenses focused on the unfolding drama. "You need to leave," Elliot said, his voice cold as he positioned himself between Derek and Rosa. Derek's practiced smile never wavered. "Leave? When I'm trying to save my fiancé from being exploited?" He turned to address the cameras directly. "That's right, folks. Rosa Mayfield isn't just some innocent victim. She's a con artist who's found her biggest mark yet." Rosa's hands trembled. "That's not true. We were never even properly engaged, Derek." "You... Oh, but I have proof." Derek pulled out his phone, his eyes glinting with malice. "I think everyone should see exactly what kind of arrangement you two have." He held up the screen, and Rosa's heart stopped. The video showed her and Elliot in what appeared to be a clandestine meeting months ago, before they'd ever met. The footage was clearly doctored, but skillfully so. It seemed to show money changing hands, whispered arrangements being made. "You edited that," Rosa whispered, her voice shaking. "We never... The timestamp says otherwise." Derek called out loudly, making sure the reporters could hear. 3 months ago, right before you conveniently showed up at his door. Tell me, how much does a billionaire pay for companionship these days?" Elliot stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. "That's enough. I'll have you arrested for trespassing." "Go ahead," Derek sneered. "Make me more of a martyr, the poor small business owner trying to expose corruption, being silenced by the powerful elite." He gestured to the cameras. "They're eating this up." Rosa watched in horror as more reporters gathered at the gate. Her phone buzzed with notifications. The story was already spreading online. Headlines screamed about scandal, about paid companions and wealthy men preying on vulnerable women. Worse were the comments about Elliot's charities. People were calling for investigations, questioning if donation money had been misused. His reputation, built over decades of careful, anonymous giving, was being torn apart because of her. "Your company's stock dropped 15% this morning," Derek said with false sympathy. "Imagine what tomorrow will bring. All because you took in a girl with a complicated past." Rosa felt sick. She knew Derek's game. He'd played it before. He'd destroy anything good in her life, and now he was using her to destroy Elliot's. That evening, after Derek finally left, and the reporters retreated to their hotels, Rosa watched Elliot field endless calls from his board of directors. His face grew more drawn with each conversation. The charities were panicking, major donors threatening to pull out. Everything he'd built was at risk. She made dinner, but neither of them could eat. The kitchen that had been filled with laughter just yesterday now felt cold and strange. Elliot tried to reassure her, saying they'd fight the allegations, but Rosa saw the worry in his eyes. "You should get some rest," she told him softly. "Tomorrow will be better." He kissed her forehead before heading upstairs, exhaustion evident in every step. Rosa waited until she heard his bedroom door close before letting her tears fall. She spent hours writing and rewriting the letter, trying to find words for an impossible goodbye. The house creaked around her, full of memories they'd built together, meals shared, gardens planted, walls that had witnessed their slow journey toward love. Finally, as the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky, she wrote the only words that felt true. "You gave me safety. Now I'll give you peace." She placed the letter on the kitchen table, where the morning light would find it first. Her few belongings fit easily in her old suitcase. She didn't take anything Elliot had given her. No clothes, no gifts, nothing that could support Derek's lies. The garden was still dark as she walked through it one last time. The flowers they'd planted together swayed in the autumn wind, already starting to wilt with the changing season. She touched a petal gently, remembering how Elliot had laughed when she taught him to deadhead roses, his usually precise hands clumsy with the delicate blooms. Dawn was breaking as she walked down the long driveway, past the sleeping reporters in their cars. They wouldn't get their story of scandal and shame. Instead, she would disappear, leaving Elliot free to rebuild his reputation, without her shadow over him. The morning air was sharp with coming winter. Rosa pulled her thin jacket tighter, each step taking her further from the only real home she'd known in years. She didn't look back, couldn't look back, knowing if she saw the house again, her resolve would break. Behind her, the empty bedroom waited for Elliot to wake. The letter lay on the table, paper trembling slightly in the morning breeze from the window she'd left open. In the garden, the last roses of summer bent their heads to the wind, petals falling like tears onto the ground where two people had briefly found, then lost, their chance at happiness. The grounds were silent, save for the whisper of falling leaves and the lonely sound of wind through empty branches. Everything they'd built together, the warmth, the laughter, the slow blooming of trust, now lay as fragile and fading as the autumn garden, waiting for the first frost to take it all away. The morning after Rosa's departure, Elliot stood motionless in the kitchen, her letter crushed in his trembling hand. Sunlight streamed through the windows she'd cleaned so carefully, highlighting the empty chair where she used to sit. The coffee maker, her coffee maker, sat silent and cold. His fingers traced the paper's edge, reading her words for the 100th time. "You gave me safety. Now I'll give you peace." The irony felt like a knife in his chest. Peace was the last thing her absence brought him. The house seemed to grow larger, emptier with each passing hour. Rooms that had buzzed with her energy now echoed with hollow footsteps. The garden she'd lovingly tended drooped in the autumn chill, as if the flowers themselves mourned her departure. His assistant, Margaret, arrived later that morning, tablet in hand and worry etched on her face. "Mr. Dane, we need to issue a statement. The board is demanding damage control. The media's running wild with speculation." Elliot stared through the window, watching leaves scatter across the lawn. "No statement," he said flatly. "But sir, the company stock—" "No, statement!" His voice carried that familiar steel edge, the one he'd used in countless boardrooms, the tone that brooked no argument. Margaret persisted anyway. "At least let me draft something simple. We could explain that Miss Mayfield was a guest who—" "Leave it." The words came out sharper than he intended. Margaret flinched, and guilt joined the mess of emotions churning in his chest. She'd worked for him for 15 years, weathered every crisis. She didn't deserve his anger, but he couldn't explain what he barely understood himself. How Rosa's presence had cracked open something he'd thought long dead. How her absence felt like losing his mother all over again. Hours blurred together. He ignored calls, let emails pile up. When the silence became too heavy, he grabbed his car keys and headed for the garage. The reporters camped outside barely had time to raise their cameras before his black Tesla shot past them, tires spraying gravel. Rain started falling as he drove, fat drops that blurred the windshield. He had no destination in mind, just an urgent need to move, to outrun the emptiness that threatened to swallow him whole. The coastal highway stretched before him, grey waves crashing against cliffs to his right. His mother used to say the ocean helped clear troubled minds, but today its vastness only reminded him of his own isolation. Every curve in the road held memories of the drive here with Rosa, her delighted gasp at the views, her insistence on stopping at small roadside stands, the way she'd hummed along with the radio. 3 hours passed before hunger forced him to stop. He pulled into a weather-beaten diner, the kind of place he would have avoided before Rosa taught him the charm of simple things. A bell jingled as he entered, and the few patrons barely glanced up from their coffee cups. An elderly waitress with silver hair and kind eyes approached his booth. "Coffee to start, hun?" Elliot nodded, not trusting his voice. She returned with a steaming mug and studied his face with unexpected recognition. "Well, I'll be," she said softly. "You're that fellow from the news, the one with the big house up the coast." He tensed, waiting for judgment or accusations. Instead, her face softened with something like sympathy. "That girl you were with? She came by last week, stopped in for breakfast on her way to church." The waitress, her name tag read Betty, smiled at the memory. "Sweet thing. Sat right here talking to me while she waited for her eggs. Said you were the best man she ever knew." The words hit him like a physical blow. His coffee cup trembled slightly as he set it down. "She said that?" His voice sounded strange to his own ears. Betty nodded. "Said you showed her what real kindness looks like. Not the showy kind that wants something back, but the quiet sort that just gives because it's right." She paused, then added gently, "Those are rare words from someone who's known hard times." Elliot stared into his coffee, seeing Rosa's face reflected in its dark surface. He remembered her in the garden, dirt on her cheeks as she planted flowers. In the kitchen, teaching him to knead bread dough. In the evening light, praying with such simple faith that God heard every whispered word. She'd brought warmth to his carefully ordered world, showed him that love wasn't a weakness to fear, but a strength to embrace. And what had he done? Hidden behind walls when trouble came, let her shoulder the burden alone until she felt she had to leave to protect him. The rain drummed steadily on the diner's roof as Betty refilled his cup. "You know," she said carefully, "my Harold was like you when I met him, scared to death of letting anyone close. Took me leaving for him to realize that hiding from the world doesn't protect your heart, it just kills it slowly." Her words echoed his mother's with uncanny precision. How many times had Sarah Dane begged him not to let fear win? How many times had she prayed he'd find the courage to love? The diner's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Elliot sat there, letting truth sink in. He'd spent 20 years building walls to keep pain out, never realizing he'd trapped himself inside instead. Rosa had shown him another way, a life of open hands and open hearts, where joy was worth the risk of loss. Betty left him to his thoughts, only returning to slip a piece of apple pie in front of him. "On the house?" she said with a wink. "You look like you could use something sweet." The first bite tasted like memory. Rosa in his mother's kitchen, flour on her nose as she rolled pie crust, laughing at his clumsy attempts to help. He'd been so afraid of losing control, he'd nearly missed the miracle of finding home again. Outside, the rain continued falling, washing the world clean. Elliot watched drops race down the window, each one carrying away another layer of the armor he'd worn for so long. The emptiness inside him shifted, making room for something new. Not the cold calculation of risk and reward, but the warm certainty of knowing what mattered most. His phone buzzed with another message from Margaret, probably another plea to manage the crisis. But for the first time in decades, Elliot Dane didn't care about managing anything. The careful walls he'd built around his heart lay in ruins, and he felt more alive than he had in years. The mansion's phone lines hadn't stopped ringing since Rosa left, but now Elliot was the one making the calls. His fingers moved across the keypad with desperate precision as he dialed yet another number from the growing list of shelters spread across his desk. "New Hope Women's Shelter, how can I help you?" The voice on the other end was tired but kind. "I'm looking for someone," Elliot said, running his hand through his disheveled hair. "Rosa Mayfield. She might have come to volunteer. I'm sorry, sir, but we can't give out information about our volunteers or residents." Click. Another dead end. He'd been at it for hours, calling every shelter in California. His normally pristine office was scattered with coffee cups and hastily scribbled notes. The computer screen glowed with dozens of open tabs, shelter directories, church organizations, women's support groups. Margaret had left 3 voicemails about damage control, but he hadn't even listened to them. Frederick appeared in the doorway, concern etched on his weathered face. "Sir, perhaps you should rest. It's nearly midnight." Elliot shook his head, already dialing the next number. "She's out there somewhere, Frederick, probably helping others while hiding her own pain. That's who she is." The butler nodded slowly. "Indeed, sir. Miss Rosa has quite a generous heart." I was a coward, Elliot said quietly, watching rain streak down the window. I let her face everything alone because I was afraid of losing control, but I've never been more lost than I am without her. The next call connected. St. Mary's Haven for Women, Sister Catherine speaking. Elliot straightened. Good evening, sister. I'm trying to locate Rosa Mayfield. She may have come to volunteer recently. There was a pause on the line. Rosa? Yes, she's been helping with our breakfast program this week. Such a blessing to have her. His heart stopped. Is she there now? No, but she'll be back in the morning. We serve breakfast at dawn. The nun hesitated. Are you the gentleman from the news stories? Yes, Elliot admitted. But they got it all wrong. Rosa is... He struggled to find words big enough. She showed me what grace looks like, and I need to tell her that. Sister Catherine's voice softened. We're at 312 Pine Street, just past the old church. Breakfast starts at 6 o'clock. Elliot was already grabbing his keys. Thank you, sister. Thank you. The roads were slick with rain as he drove through the night. His headlights cut through sheets of water, illuminating familiar territory. He passed the same coastal highway where his company headquarters stood, the coffee shop where he'd once held meetings, the park where he'd watched families from a distance. Everything looked different now, transformed by memories of Rosa. She'd taught him to see beauty in broken things, hope in dark places. Her faith had been so simple, so pure, like a light that made shadows flee. 3 hours into the drive, he passed the bus stop where she'd first appeared that stormy night. Now it stood empty, a single streetlight casting a lonely glow. Elliot slowed, remembering how she'd looked, drenched and desperate, but still holding on to dignity. He'd almost turned her away. The thought made him shudder now. Rain drummed steadily on the roof as he pressed on through the darkness. Towns blurred past, their lights smearing like watercolors across his windshield. He rehearsed what he would say, then realized words would never be enough. How do you tell someone they've awakened your soul? The sky was just beginning to lighten when he reached Pine Street. The old church rose against the pale dawn, its spire piercing through lingering storm clouds. Behind it, a modest building buzzed with early morning activity. Elliot parked across the street, his hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel. Through the mist he could see women gathering, some in worn coats, others clutching children's hands. They formed a quiet line at the side door where volunteers were setting up tables. And then he saw her. Rosa moved between the tables with grace, wearing the coat he'd lent her that first night. Her hair was pulled back simply, and though she looked tired, her face glowed with the same gentle radiance he remembered. She smiled as she poured coffee, touched shoulders reassuringly, knelt to speak to a small child clutching his mother's skirt. Elliot sat transfixed, watching her, kindness bloom even here, even after everything she'd been through. She was serving others while carrying her own wounds, giving away love she'd never fully received. The rain had softened to a gentle drizzle, beading on his windshield like tears. Morning light caught the drops, turning them to diamonds. Rosa paused in her work to look up at the clearing sky, and for a moment her face held such peace that Elliot's breath caught. This was who she truly was. Not a scandal, not a victim, but a soul of rare beauty who saw God's grace in every broken thing, including him. He watched as she turned back to her work, distributing warm bread and hope in equal measure. Women who arrived with downcast eyes left with lighter steps, touched by her gentle spirit. She remembered names, asked about children, celebrated small victories. Elliot's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. He had spent years hiding behind wealth and walls, thinking he was protecting himself. But Rosa had shown him true strength, the courage to keep loving despite loss, to stay soft in a hard world. The morning light grew stronger, pushing back the last shadows of night. Through the windshield, Elliot could see every detail clearly now. The worn steps of the church, the steam rising from coffee cups, the way Rosa's smile reached her eyes even when she was tired. She was thinner than when she'd left, but her movements held the same grace, the same quiet dignity that had first drawn him in. She wiped her hands on her apron and reached for another pot of coffee, unaware of his presence across the street. A woman with 2 small children approached, and Rosa's face lit up in recognition. She hugged them close, then disappeared inside, returning with extra muffins for the little ones. Watching her, Elliot finally understood what his mother had tried to teach him all those years ago. Love wasn't a weakness to guard against. It was the only strength worth having, and he had found it in the last place he expected, on his doorstep in the rain. The old wooden door creaked as Elliot stepped into the church's side entrance. The smell of coffee and fresh bread filled the warm kitchen air. His footsteps echoed on the worn linoleum floor as he made his way past stainless steel counters and industrial-sized ovens. Rosa stood at the sink, her back to him, humming softly as she washed dishes. The morning light caught her hair, turning it to honey gold. At the sound of his approach, she turned and froze. The plate in her hands clattered into the sink. "Elliot?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Before either could speak further, a commotion erupted from the main entrance. Pastor Miriam Hale's firm voice carried through the hallway. "Please, this is a house of worship. You'll need to wait outside." The distinctive click of cameras and murmur of reporters filtered in. They'd followed his car, just as they had for weeks. Rosa's face fell, that old fear creeping back into her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she started. "I never meant to bring this to—" But Elliot was already moving, not away from the chaos, as he'd done his whole life, but toward it. He walked straight through the kitchen doors into the main sanctuary, where Pastor Miriam was trying to hold back a small crowd of journalists. "Mr. Dane, is it true you're pressing charges? Was she after your money? Did she manipulate you?" The questions flew like arrows, but for once, they didn't make him flinch. Instead, he walked purposefully down the center aisle, past wooden pews worn smooth by years of faithful prayers. At the front, he turned and stepped onto the small pulpit platform. "You want a story?" His voice rang clear in the vaulted space. "Here's your story." The reporters fell silent, cameras rolling. Rosa stood in the kitchen doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth. Pastor Miriam watched with knowing eyes as church members began filtering in, drawn by the commotion. "I was the one who needed saving," Elliot said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "When Rosa Mayfield knocked on my door that night, I was a man who had everything and nothing. I had wealth but no warmth, success but no soul." He looked directly at the cameras now, his hands steady on the pulpit. "She didn't ruin me. She redeemed me. She taught me that real strength isn't in walls we build, but in the courage to let them fall." Rosa's eyes filled with tears as he continued. "I spent my whole life afraid of love, afraid of being hurt, being used, being left. But Rosa showed me that faith isn't about being fearless. It's about finding something worth being brave for." The morning sun broke through the stained glass windows, painting the sanctuary in jeweled light. Blue, gold, and rose-colored beams danced across the wooden floors. "She never asked me for money, never wanted my protection. She gave me something far more valuable. She showed me how to trust again, how to pray again, how to love again." Elliot stepped down from the pulpit, his footsteps echoing in the hushed sanctuary. The reporters' cameras followed him as he walked toward Rosa, but for once, he didn't notice them at all. When he reached her, he knelt, not with the practiced elegance of a businessman, but with the humility of a man who had finally found his truth. "I'm not offering you wealth or security," he said softly, taking her trembling hands in his. "I'm offering you love. Simple, honest love. The kind you taught me was possible." Tears streamed down Rosa's face as she nodded, unable to speak. Behind her, Pastor Miriam smiled, her own eyes glistening. The congregation burst into spontaneous applause as Elliot stood and pulled Rosa into his arms. She buried her face in his shoulder, her tears soaking his jacket. He held her close, feeling her heart beat against his chest. Two rhythms finding their shared song at last. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, bathing them in pools of gold and azure. The cameras flashed, capturing the moment, but neither Rosa nor Elliot noticed. They had found something far more precious than any headline could capture. They had found grace. The spring breeze carried the scent of roses through the open church windows. 6 months after Elliot's public declaration, the same sanctuary buzzed with quiet excitement. White flowers and soft ribbons adorned every pew, transforming the humble space into something magical. In the small side room, Rosa stood before a mirror, her wedding dress simple but elegant. Women from the shelter, now her dearest friends, fussed over her veil. Sarah, who'd arrived at the shelter 3 months ago with 2 black eyes, carefully pinned a white rose in Rosa's hair. "You gave us all hope," Sarah whispered, squeezing Rosa's hand. "Now it's your turn to receive it." Down the hall, Elliot adjusted his tie with trembling fingers. Pastor Miriam knocked softly before entering. "The women wanted you to have this," she said, holding out a hand-stitched handkerchief. "They embroidered your initials together." Elliot ran his thumb over the delicate E and R stitched in blue thread. These women, whom society had cast aside, had become his family too. The ceremony itself was intimate and profound. Rosa walked down the aisle to guitar music played by one of the shelter residents. When Elliot saw her, tears filled his eyes, something that would have mortified him a year ago. Now he let them fall freely. They exchanged vows beneath the same stained glass windows that had witnessed their reunion. Rosa promised to keep teaching him about faith and forgiveness. Elliot vowed to spend his life proving that love was stronger than fear. After the celebration, they drove to the cliffside mansion, but it wasn't the cold, empty place it had once been. The gates now bore a new sign: Grace Harbor, a place of healing and hope. The transformation had taken months of careful planning. The East Wing now housed comfortable rooms for women and children seeking refuge. The formal dining room had become a communal gathering space, and the library was filled with resources for job training and education. Rosa oversaw the daily operations with gentle wisdom, while Elliot provided silent financial support. He'd learned that true generosity didn't need recognition. It needed heart. The garden where they'd once planted flowers now expanded into a therapeutic space. Rescued dogs romped on the lawn, while residents tended vegetable beds. The sound of children laughing echoed where silence had once ruled. Every evening, as the sun began its descent over the Pacific, Elliot and Rosa walked their favorite path through the gardens. Their fingers intertwined, they'd pause to watch the golden light paint the waves below. "Remember when you thought this place was too big for just one person?" Rosa asked one such evening, leaning against his shoulder. Elliot smiled, watching a group of women chat on the patio. Nearby, music drifted from the kitchen window. Someone was teaching piano to the children. A therapy dog trotted past with his tail wagging. "Now it's perfectly sized," he said softly, "for all of us." Inside, the marble halls that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with life. Women gathered in the kitchen, sharing recipes and stories. Children did homework at the big table where Elliot used to sit alone. Prayer meetings and support groups filled the rooms with hope and healing. The study where Elliot had first met Rosa on that stormy night became their shared office. Her gentle touch had softened its corporate severity with family photos and children's artwork. The charity proposals he once handled alone, they now reviewed together, their different perspectives creating stronger solutions. Some evenings, they'd host community dinners in the courtyard. Tables stretched end to end, filled with food and conversation. Elliot, who once ate in silence, found himself surrounded by a symphony of voices, women sharing victories, children telling stories, staff members planning programs. The media eventually lost interest in their story, finding no scandal in simple goodness. But the real story continued to unfold in quiet moments. In the tears of a woman finding her strength again, in the laughter of children feeling safe for the first time, in the prayers that filled every corner of Grace Harbor with peace. For Elliot and Rosa, their greatest joy came in watching love multiply. Every life touched at Grace Harbor became a ripple of hope, spreading outward into the world. Their own love had grown into something larger than themselves, exactly as Rosa had always believed it would. The mansion on the hill was no longer silent. It had become a symphony of healing, each voice adding its own note to the melody of grace. 1 year after their wedding, Grace Harbor buzzed with anticipation. Rosa had spent weeks planning this surprise, working with a local artist to restore the faded photograph she'd found in Elliot's old family albums. The portrait of Elizabeth Dane now hung in the chapel's alcove, her gentle smile watching over the space where so many found healing. Elliot stood frozen when Rosa led him into the chapel that evening. His mother's face, brought back to life through careful brush strokes, seemed to glow in the soft lighting. Her eyes held that same warmth he remembered from childhood, the kindness that had sustained him through dark years. "How did you—" His voice caught as he reached out to touch the frame. Rosa squeezed his hand. "I found the photo in that box we discovered last spring. The artist said your mother had the kindest eyes she'd ever painted." Tears glistened in Elliot's eyes as he studied his mother's face. She'd spent her final days praying he would find his way to compassion, to open his heart to others. Now, standing in this chapel that had become a sanctuary for so many, he realized he'd finally fulfilled her deepest wish. Outside, the anniversary celebration was beginning. Lanterns swayed in the evening breeze, casting warm light across tables set throughout the garden. Residents past and present mingled with staff and supporters, creating a tapestry of lives transformed by Grace Harbor. 6-year-old Sophie, one of their newest residents, tugged at Elliot's sleeve as he and Rosa joined the gathering. Her curious eyes looked up at him with the directness only children possess. "Mr. Dane," she asked, "is love hard to find?" Elliot knelt down to her level, something that would have felt foreign to him just a year ago. He glanced across the garden at Rosa, who was helping an elderly resident to her seat. His heart swelled with gratitude. "I waited 45 years," he told Sophie softly. "God just made sure it was the real kind." The evening air filled with music and laughter as dinner was served. Stories flowed freely, tales of healing, of second chances, of faith restored. Rosa and Elliot moved through the crowd hand in hand, their joy multiplied by the happiness surrounding them. As twilight settled over the gathering, they found a quiet moment beneath the lanterns. Elliot pulled Rosa close, kissing her with a tenderness that still surprised him. Around them, the garden glowed with warmth and life. The roses Rosa had planted during that first uncertain week now climbed the garden walls in abundance. Their sweet fragrance drifted across the hill on the evening breeze, a reminder of how love could bloom in the most unexpected places. Elliot closed his eyes, offering a silent prayer of gratitude for the woman who had taught him to trust again, for the community they'd built together, for his mother's prayers finally answered. The wind carried the scent of roses across the glowing hill, blessing them all with its gentle grace. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe. And tomorrow, I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.